Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum from Dr. F.K. Haidri Official. I am Faisal Kamal Haidri, and today we are going to have a special session, a session on language, on translation, on message, on content, what we say, what we think, and as to how it gets up to the others. But actually, whatever we say, communicate, or convey, it's not the original message. It's the reflection or the transformation of our thoughts, ideas, perceptions, conceptions into verbal and non verbal signs that create communication. It means we can say that throughout our life, whenever we communicate or express ourselves, we go through the process of translation. But this process is so delicate, so spontaneous, rather so natural that we never think that we breathe in translational environment. And those who realize it begin to strive as to how this process may be made more effective, giving birth to different theories and approaches. With us, we have one such eminent translation scholar today, the most vibrant advocate of functional approaches, deviser of the functional approaches to translation, not only the deviser, but rather the actually inventor, you may say, of the idea or the concept of loyalty plus function. To be precise, function plus loyalty to functional approaches to translation. So let's welcome today Professor Dr. Christiane Nord. Well, first of all, we must welcome you.
Yes, thank you very much. Salam alaikum.
Oh, that's great. So thank you so very much for gracing this platform with your presence today. Well, before going into the intensive sort of questions or sort of a dried, well, people might say dried sort of a discussion as well, let's begin with some lighter sort of things. Well, the discipline, translation studies, is still an emerging sort of a field. It has emerged though, but it is still emerging, just 50, 60 years old discipline. So, 5, 6 decades ago, what made you feel that you started studying translation in your BA honors?
That's a long story, but I'll cut it short because it's a kind of genetic thing. It runs in the family. My mother was a translator.
Okay.
And from very little, she made me say things in English or she taught me Italian songs and so on. So from very little, I grew up with this sensitivity towards language and translation. So I decided to study translation in Heidelberg, where my mother had studied translation 25 years before, during the Second World War. And my mother had studied Italian and English, and I thought, no, I'm not going to do everything like my mom, so I'll choose Spanish and English.
Okay.
Not very original. Okay, so there is a third step to this story, because my daughter, 25 years later, studied translation in Heidelberg as well, and she is a translator. So now we are waiting for
the next 25
for
years.
the next, yeah, it will be probably a little more, because these young people, these young women, they wait so long until they have children.
You mean to say every third decade your family is producing a translator and a translation expert?
So maybe we are waiting now for an interpreter, which might be nice for a change, because my grandchildren grow up bilingual in Italian with Italian and German. So perhaps this would be a good start for a conference interpreter. Okay, but this is the short version.
So it means it runs in your family. The translation, bilingualism or something runs in your family. So by that time, had you ever done that Christiane rising, up to such an eminent translation scholar in the 21st century?
Of course not. Of course not. I wanted to be a translator and translate. In the beginning, I think I wanted to translate literature. And even at school, of course, in the foreign language classes, including Latin, we had to translate, and I even started to translate Ovid's poems into verse when we had to do this at homework and so on. So I spent a lot of time translating and thinking about translation, but of course there wasn't any theory behind it because the theory didn't exist at the time. So it didn't even exist when I studied in the 1960s.
At least not the sort of theories that you like, by the way, in the future.
No,
because
no theory at all.
It was a period of linguistic approaches somehow.
But we didn't really come into contact with these. We did practical translation, and it was all about language. Into the foreign language, we usually enhanced our active language competence. From the foreign language into German, we enhanced our knowledge of our mother tongue, and that was it. We had a little bit of linguistics, lexicology and some semantics and so on.
In other words, unconscious linguistic approaches, you may say.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, when we start to actually match the words, match the sentences, the tense structure.
It was all about equivalence and find the right equivalence. And when we asked the teachers, how do we have to translate this or that, they usually said it depends. But they never told us on what it depended. So this was 4 years of studies, and I never had any. Well, perhaps the last term, with my teacher Katharina Reis. She was an eminent scholar, really. And but she was somehow the personified norm. When she said, "This is how we say this in German," it was exactly that we said it in German like this, and we all wrote it down and said it like this. The student revolution hadn't taken place yet, so we still believed in the teacher as a kind of God who was the embodied norm. Without any doubts. No, okay. But after I finished, after my graduation, 2 weeks afterwards, I taught my first class to the students who had been sitting by my side 2 weeks earlier, and now they were sitting in front of me.
You're talking about of early 70s or late 60s, perhaps?
Because we're still in the 60s.
So you're talking about 67, precisely.
Yeah, 67 was when I graduated. Exactly. And Katharina Reis asked me whether I would like to teach. And I said, yes. Why not? So I taught, and I didn't have any instruction as to teaching. Katharina Reis, one day she came and sat in the back of my classroom, and after that she said, "It's okay, just go on doing this like you did. It's fine." Okay, so this was my my career, the beginning of my career.
Of your career, and you took translation classes in the beginning? Or it was just of the language classes?
No, I did language classes, but I did also translation classes, always into German, Spanish. I was part of the Spanish department, and so it was Spanish-German. And I did some classes on text analysis, which much later was turned into my first book on text analysis and translation. But this was everything very, very eclectic. It was just, that was the time when text linguistics came around.
Yes.
And of course, I tried to read and make myself acquainted with this. But mainly I did what the other teachers had been doing with me before. So I just imitated the teachers I had liked best, and that was my pedagogy in the first few years. And then I was a young woman, I married, and at that time, when you married, more or less a year later, you had a baby. And then some years later, you had another baby. So I was busy teaching at the School of Translation and Interpreting, and I didn't really have any time to do anything else but teaching and raising my children and household and so on. I had a full-time job.
So this is how actually you turned into a teacher from the student, and then obviously a wife, and then a mother as well.
Yeah.
So
it took quite a long time until I turned into a kind of scholar, because that was only when my kids had come to an age when they didn't need me so much anymore, and I had a kind of crisis. Because I thought, okay, what's the rest? What about the rest of my life? I had a job without end, so I could have done the same thing until I was 65. And now I was not even 30. And I thought, my goodness, is this all? And I had a crisis, and to come through this crisis, I thought of doing a PhD. Okay.
In order to come out of the crisis, you decided to do PhD.
Yeah.
And you opted for Romance studies.
Yes, because translation studies didn't exist.
No, but I'm just intending to say that in order to coming out of the crisis, you started romance studies.
Yeah, I studied Old Spanish, for example, and Spanish Latin American literature. And then I went to one of the professors and said, do you think I could do a PhD? And he said, I have been waiting for you to come. And I thought, how come? How did he know? I had no idea. So then I said, what do you want to do? You wanted to give me some topic. Somebody had left. And there was a topic on terminology, technology, and so on. And I said, no, I don't want to do this. And they said, what do you want to do? And I said, I have to do something from which I benefit for my classes, my students and my classes. Because apart from teaching full-time and having a family, I cannot just start something very new. I have to do something I've been doing and something that feeds into my classes and the students benefit from it. Okay, so in Spain, Generalissimo Franco had died, and 1978, and very suddenly the Spanish language was invaded from outside, and it was a kind of revolution of the Spanish language with regard to lexis. because the student always asked me, said, "This is a word, it is not in the dictionary, and how can we translate it?" And I said, I want to do something for them. And this is what I did. So I wrote a PhD on the latest developments in Spanish, in the Spanish language, with regard to lexis.
This we may connect to the fact that obviously, while doing your PhD in Romance Studies, you turned towards the translation because you had been working on the linguistic intricacies or such sort of language intricacies.
Yes, but this hadn't got anything or hardly anything to do with translation. What I did, the most translation-oriented thing I did was that I found the equivalents of these new words I found. So, no, this was not, translation studies didn't exist and couldn't be chosen as a topic for PhD, and it was a linguistic study.
It was a linguistic study.
But
in your postdoc, actually, then you went for the applied translations and the pedagogy of translation. By that time,
by that time I didn't. So it took me 3 years to do this PhD. And then when we celebrated this, Hans Vermeer said, "Why don't you go on?" And I said, "What do you mean? I think I would like to live now a little more than before, because it really took a lot of my time." And no, but he sort of pushed me a little, and it was funny because doing this PhD, I had really enjoyed this kind of activity, which I hadn't done before. During our translation program, there wasn't anything like this, or hardly anything. And so it was the first time I really tried to find out something and to choose the material, to compile a large corpus of words and so on, and analyze them. And it was really something I liked a lot. So I thought, yeah, I might go on. And then I thought I had given this class on text analysis, and I thought, why don't I write a book on this with the material I had and everything? So
can we say that a certain sort of a vacuum tempted you to jump into it?
Yeah, a vacuum, yes, or perhaps I was just mature enough to see the benefits or to enjoy scholarly work. I hadn't come across this before, so it was a kind of eye-opening experience, and I thought, well, this is really fun. Of course, my marriage suffered a lot from this, and that was more or less the end of it. But anyway, so I was married to scholarly activities then, and I wrote this book on text analysis in translation, and I wanted to apply for habilitation with it, which did not work out as I wanted to do it, because it has to do, I don't want to go into this, it has to do with German academia and the situation. I was this little student who had studied there, and now with a PhD, they all said, "Oh, congratulations, we wish more people would do it." But habilitation is something different, because I turned into a competitor. And afterwards I was applying for the same posts my former teachers were applying for, and that was not so good. So it was just published as a book and didn't really get to habilitation. I had the habilitation much later, 10 years later in Vienna, but At that time, I just published the book, and this, of course, I had to rewrite the thesis it had been, so I rewrote it as a book for students, and it is still a classic. So I don't know.
Okay. No, of course.
40 years.
Yes.
I wrote it 40 years ago, and it is still a classic, and it still sells both not only in German but also in English and Spanish. It has been translated into modern Greek, Brazilian Portuguese,
Obviously,
and Arabic.
if I have read it way there in Pakistan, obviously it is. Well, by the way, it's a good book. I mean, it's a good learning experience for it's a really good work. So,
that was my entry into translation studies.
That was your serious entry into translation. Otherwise, you had entered already. By the way, so before, how do you, for the students who would be watching our discussion, as a student, generally people are finding the references, the quotations, the citations, sort of a thing. So, as now, not as functionalist, not as the expert, translation expert, in general way, how do you translate beyond any intricacies of theories and approaches? General definition. What would be the general definition of translation to you?
For me, the general definition of translation is making communication possible between two or more parties who do not share the same language and culture. So mediating, you could say, between these parties who couldn't communicate directly because of differences of language and culture. And I would always say language and culture or lingua culture, because this is something that was during my studies as a student. Culture was never even mentioned. So I think this is important, that it is always about language and culture.
And perhaps that actually induced you to functionalism. Let's begin functionalism getting in from the definition. Now, what is your definition of functionalism or functional approach to translation?
I can say that it is the application of the Scopus theory to teaching and practice. So some people sometimes ask me, saying, people say, is Scopus theory or is functionalism compatible with Scopus theory? And he said, it is not only compatible, it's got a development, an application of. So Scopus theory is a theoretical basis, and functionalism is hyperonym, an umbrella term for everything that was derived from Scopus theory, and it was derived first of all for teaching. And I think even when Vermeer designed his Scopus theory, he was thinking of teaching, but teaching future professional translators. So teaching for the profession. And so teaching and practice is both in focus.
Okay, now, as you say, that application of Scopus theory actually may be termed as functionalism. But its basis begin way, back before him. Whenever we start to teach the students functionalism or functional theories, obviously we begin at least from Katharina Rice.
Yes, and I think, Katharina Rice is a kind of predecessor. She was my teacher. She taught me to translate, and she was a fantastic teacher. But until her dying day, and she was almost 99 when she died, she believed in the source text as the sine qua non of translation. And Scopus theory is a general theory which does not value the source text as high as this. And when she wrote this book or co-authored this book with Hans Vermeer about Skopos theory, she called her theory a specialized theory, not the general, but the specific theory for those cases where the Skopos should be functional equivalence. So that was her idea.
I mean, for my own understanding, or for those who try to understand it, I mean, you meant to say that Scopus theory was a general theory, whereas she tried to fill in the vacuum that
No,
might
she was
have been.
first. Vermeer was also a student of Katharina Reis. So Katharina Reis was first, and she had this text typology, which leads to a kind of functional equivalence at the level of text type. Not only text, but text type. So if you have an expressive text in the source, you are supposed to produce an expressive text in the target language. So that was her idea. And the functional aspect comes in her book on translation criticism. She has an exception for this equivalence thing, because she was a translator as well. She translated several books from Spanish into German, and she knew that equivalence is not always called for or possible. Just think of Bible translation, and equivalence really doesn't make any sense in this case. So she had an exception to the equivalence principle, that she said, if equivalence is not possible or not asked for, then it will be the function, this prospective function of the translation process, which is the standard for translation. Okay, so this is, but for her, it's the exception to the rule of equivalence. And Vermeer turned this upside down, and he said, function is the general thing, and a specific function could be equivalence. So it was just turned round, and that is the main difference. So when he wrote this book together with her, people say, this doesn't really fit together, the two parts of the could be equivalence. So it was just turned round, and that is the main difference. So when he wrote this book together with her, people say, this doesn't really fit together, the two parts of the book.
Yes, of course.
It
They
is
have,
a bit
they have their
difficult.
own direction somehow.
Yeah.
They have their own directions. But well, sticking to the term functionalism or function, or the function, because this is what actually is debated upon generally in the field of translation studies as well, and you people have faced a lots of criticism as well. People like Anthony Pym or such sort of people have been. I mean,
My
you know,
special
well,
friend. No, but we're good friends, actually.
No. I always term it as the intellectual discourse or something where you can have disagreement.
Sometimes it's
But my viewpoint is that how do you separate your functionalism with the functional dynamic or functional equivalence of NIDA?
It's much broader. The functional equivalence of NIDA is included in functionalism, but functionalism is not limited to functional equivalence, because word for word interlinear translation can be functional if just this is the scopos. If you are asked to write a gloss on some biblical text or Quran text or whatever, and you do a word for word interlinear, and this is what the commissioner asks for, this is functional. And this is a problem because people always think functional means adapting, like with NIDA. Huh? But it is not true. It depends. It can be all sorts of all kinds of translation forms between the interlinear on the one end,
Yes, of course.
and the free adaptation at the other end, and all the different steps
So
in
don't you
between.
think that NIDA actually tried to cover the interlinear part of the translational action in his formal
Yeah, but
correspondence?
formal equivalence, he had these two equivalences. But equivalence doesn't work. And also, even his functional equivalence doesn't really work all the time. It's an illusion very often. But I know I'm involved in Bible translation with United Bible Societies, etc., and I know that they have believed in NIDA for ages, but now, thanks to my missionary work,
Yes,
they
of
are
course.
sort of turning to functionalism.
Yes, of course, that is very commendable. That is not at all. No, of course, that is very commendable. But my question here is that, let's say, on one hand, we have formal equivalence and functional equivalence phenomenon, and on the other hand, we have documentary translation and instrumental translation.
Yeah.
How shall we actually separate, or how shall we say that, I mean, documentary translation may have to do with formal equivalence,
Yeah.
and
Not
the
only.
instrumental may have to
No.
do with functional.
No, it is not, because you have to look at my diagram and you will see that documentary translation is more than just formal equivalence. So even what I call exoticizing translation, which perhaps is a form for your poetic translations, belongs to the documentary, and it wouldn't by no means be formal equivalence for neither.
Yes.
No?
It might be. Well, actually, obviously, both of you are trying to display your own point of view, number one. Number two, obviously, coming up with your own concepts and views. Obviously, that we cannot say that they must be very identical or the same. If they are to
No.
be the same, obviously, then what is the need
What
of
is
presenting
the-
a new-
what-
something
yeah.
new? Now, when we, exoticize poetic sort of translations, obviously, according to NIDA, they may fall in functional equivalence.
No.
Or what? Another. Let's add another question. Equivalent effect.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about that? Equivalent effect and the documentary translation and
No, the
exoticization
documentary-
and exoticization.
The documentary translation will never ever lead to equivalent effect, apart from the fact that I hate the word equivalent. But let's just stay there.
Okay.
No, it cannot be, because
It's-
documentary means that the target audience is aware of reading a translation. And this, of course, is a different effect from people who read the original and have some effect and feel some effect. So a documentary is always a receiver of a documentary translation is always an observer, observing people communicating in a different culture, which sometimes is a bit strange, but this is the point in this case. Whereas in instrumental translations, people are usually not aware of reading a translation, and they don't care anyway. That is, of course, the other day somebody asked me and said, "Oh, do you like the new novel by Isabel Allende?" I love her style, this person said. And I said, you love her style? You read it in Spanish? She said, "No, of course not. I don't know Spanish. I read it in German." Said, "And how do you know that was her style, what you liked so much?" This they are not, even with literary text, people are not aware or they forget. It's somewhere written, translated from the Spanish by so and so.
Yes,
But
of course.
then people forget.
Hmm.
And this is fine. It's like with dubbed film. I forget that it is dubbed. You have not quite lip synchronicity, but you overlook it because you want to succumb to this illusion that it is exactly what they're saying. And the same is with translation. But a documentary translation does not have this effect.
Okay, so let's move forward somewhat.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, during our discussion, we have reached to the point that functionalism always puts the whole emphasis on the target audience, target environment, sort of a
Yeah.
thing. Now,
That is
this is
the
what-
shift. Huh?
this
That's
is called the
exactly
shift.
the
This
shift.
is called the shift.
Yeah.
And
Of
even we
perspective.
say paradigmatic paradigm
Yeah.
shift. So, do you think that before functionalism, no one laid, if it is a shift, it means that before functionalism, target text was not looked upon as it is looked upon, as it is seen in functionalism. Or, in other words, I may rephrase my question that before functionalism, don't you think so that people have been actually laying emphasis on target elements as well?
Practitioners always have looked at the target audience, but theoreticians haven't. So, in theory, it is a shift. In practice, there have always been people who asked what will be the effect on the target audience.
Yes, of course. And
But
what
they
about those?
don't care about theory. They say, I don't need theory, I just do it.
Obviously, at that time, theoretic work was not being done on translation studies.
No, but
we
it's
have,
still,
we
it
have
is
to
still
rely,
like
we have to
this.
rely on comments. The sort of the comments we see in
Yeah.
Cicero when he says that
Yeah.
we should not go for the word-to-word rendition, we should go for the sense. And even talking of Martin Luther,
Yeah.
he used to say that we should first of all understand as
That's-
to how Germans speak. Then
No,
only
this
we
is
will-
but this is only half of the story, and you forget the other quote by Luther where he says, "And where the word is concerned, I wouldn't change a iota, which is the tiniest letter in Greek. I wouldn't change, or I haven't changed a iota." So it's always these two types.
Two
Naida's two types,
Yes.
my two types.
Yes.
Luther's two types.
Yes.
But what we know about Luther is this look or listen to how people speak and translate like this. I grew up with Luther's Bible translation, and I have one 1600 so and so there. And I found that in the narrative texts, he used this principle. And these are texts which still, after 500 years, you still can read them apart from some words which have changed their meanings and so on. Okay, fine. But they're still readable, comprehensible. Whereas I doubt whether, for example, the more theological texts, the letters by St. Paul and so on, whether his contemporaries really understood them, I'm not so sure. But at least today, you don't understand them or you misunderstand them because central concepts like what is a person, for example, we use the word person, it is the equivalent of the word which is in the text. But we have a different concept.
On a lighter note, by the way, do we understand 500-year-old text, original texts,
Yeah.
the way we can understand, or we try to understand Martin Luther?
I don't know. My Greek is really a bit fragile, but but of course, people who know ancient Greek, they can understand the original texts in Greek, although the biblical Greek is different
Still difficult.
different from classical Homer or so.
But yes, to this extent, I agree that obviously the sort of the jargon, the sort of the systematic approach functionalism or functional approaches gave to translation that are very commendable, because before that we had some implicit sort of scattered sort of isolated sort of statements that actually functionalists actually gathered and then gave them the sequence that was required for a certain sort of an approach or a theory. Now, moving forward to specific your concept. Function plus quality. First of all, yet again, because you're a teacher, I'm a teacher, I'm a humble sort of a teacher, a little teacher, and you're an experienced one. What would you tell to the students of translation studies? In just one line, two line, what is function plus loyalty principle?
Well, in Skopos theory, according to Skopos theory, one specific source text would allow any justifiable translation if required by the brief. So this is Skopos theory. But it's an abstract theory. And now I'm applying this, and I'm teaching this to students who want to be practical practitioners, practical professional translators. And practical practitioners have to deal with other people. So I think this one text allows any kind of translation, according to the Skopos, does not work in practice when I have to cooperate with people who have certain expectations with regard to a translation. They expect a translation to be like blah, blah, blah. They have a kind of subjective theory, as I call it, which does not have to be consistent, which is just derived from their experience, their personal experience, and this is what they think a translation should be like. And when I now do something in my translation which does not conform to this expectation, I think I have to tell them. So with the Bible translation or New Testament translation I did with my husband, we are translating in different ways. And what we did, we wrote a foreword explaining what we did, why we did it, with examples. So people wouldn't be disappointed and say, what is right? What is the Bible? What is the letter to the Romans? This is quite different from what I have read before. Yeah. And especially with Bible, you have so many different Bible translations, and which of them is the Word of God? So I think we owe these people an explanation, and this is what I call loyalty, because the translator in this cooperative activity of translation is the only person who knows both sides. The commissioner is either the source or the target side, the target receivers are the target side, the author is the source culture side, and the translator in the middle is, by way of her office and competence, the only one who knows both sides and mediates between them and has to explain. Okay, and in this case I would agree with Venuti that translators should be more visible, but not more visible with regard to their language, that they write funny language because this is making them visible, but visible as persons who...
Visible with their disclaimers.
Yeah, exactly.
In other words, obviously with their disclaimers.
This is not the source text, it is my text, the style is my style, and I have a reason why I write it this way.
Now, obviously it's a part of, I mean, essential part of functional approaches.
Yeah.
Now, function plus loyalty principle. And we know that the functionalism has been actually developed in classroom environment to
Yeah.
judge, to evaluate, to guide the students first of all, and
Yeah.
then to evaluate their translations.
Yeah.
Now, do you think your concept to be a guideline,
Yeah.
a principle?
Sure.
And if a principle, do you think that it is too subjective to be evaluated?
No. No. It is not.
Obviously, I'm not differing. I'm just putting the question.
Yeah. No, I think it definitely is a guideline. Like I told you about my PhD, I want to do something for my teaching because I'm a teacher 100% from beginning to end, and everything I do and write and develop is geared towards teaching. So when I work on, for example, my four-function model and say how can you identify function markers in text, this is all geared towards teaching to make it more applicable. And teachers and students, or now practitioners, ex-students, tell me that it works in real life. And I have translated not only Bible but also other texts from Latin, among others, into German. And I think it works. And the loyalty principle is sort of the ethical background which I owe to people who do not know about translation, but they have to trust me. And I have to trust them.
We can obviously, as a translator, as a person, as long as we know ABC or anyone, I mean, if we know you, if we know anyone else, obviously we can say that he or she is a very good person, very fair sort of a person. If he says or she says so, obviously it must be the way he or she is saying. That's what my question was.
No.
That, don't you think so that it becomes I mean, if I claim about my translation that my commissioner was wanting this and that, since I did not agree with him or her, that's why I have actually deviated from that. So I have exercised your function plus loyalty. But who would believe, and how would he believe?
No, with regard to the source text author, I also owe loyalty to him or her. And if the author writes that green is a wonderful color, but I'm not, I don't agree, I think blue is much nicer, I cannot just, and this is exactly part of it, I cannot just put blue instead of green, of course. But this is not only the author. People have always said, yeah, the loyalty to the author, this is faithfulness, etc. No, it's loyalty with regard to all the other people who interfere in this action. So the commissioner tells me he or she wants this. They are not supposed to tell me how to translate, please, because I'm the expert and it's my responsibility. And I said, you tell me what you need and let me do my job. And don't tell me, but I want you to translate this word like that. And I said, no, just let me do my job. I'm doing this and I'm taking this into consideration. If the commissioner asked me to do something which I cannot make compatible with my ethical concerns with regard to the author, I am in a dilemma. But this means I would have to negotiate the brief and say, okay, I'm not just doing what you tell me because you are the one who pays, and I'm not doing just what the author tells me because he is the author, he or she is the author, but I'm trying to negotiate. And then say, okay, yes, the commissioner wants this and this and this. and I say, okay, I can do this in this way, and think of my loyalty towards the author and the readers, because the readers think that they're reading the author's thoughts and not the translator's thoughts.
Okay.
So I
in
think
other words, we may say that actually through this concept we have tried to empower the translator first of all,
Yes.
and then by actually suggesting him to be loyal to the author and the readers,
Yeah.
you have tried that whatever comes to the readers, they should know what actually has happened
Yeah.
behind the screen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Obviously, this in this context, obviously, it is a very appreciable and a very pragmatic sort of a concept.
Yeah.
So, this was a discussion, viewers, from the person who has spent her whole life, we may say now,
Right. Yeah.
50, 60 years.
Yeah.
Well, actually, generally in Pakistan especially, this is the complete time span that a person lives. The whole life of a person.
Yeah.
And she has all the examples with her for her claims. And this is how a theory comes into practice. And when it comes into practice, it is applicable and it is appreciable. We're very much thankful to you, Dr. Nod, for being with us and sharing your valuable views and precious moments of your life. We're really thankful to you.
No, I thank you. It was a pleasure for me and an honor.
Thank you. So that's all. This was what we had for you today.
Wonderful.
Be a part of Dr. F.K. Haidri Official, where we wish to come up to you with what is generally left and what is generally overlooked. So be a part of us so that we may create an intellectual discourse that is lacking in our society. Thank you.